The morning of March 14, 1952, arrived in Harlem the way most mornings did that winter, gray, cold, and indifferent to the ambitions of the men who moved through it. By 7 o'clock, the streets along Lenox Avenue were already filling with the particular rhythm of a neighborhood that never quite stopped moving. Produce deliverers stacked crates outside corner groceries. Women in house leaned from upper-floor windows, drawing in milk bottles left on fire, escapes overnight. Numbers runners in long wool coats walked their routes with the practiced casualness of men who had learned to look like they were going nowhere in particular. The temperature sat just below freezing, and the breath of everyone on the street rose in small, brief clouds before disappearing into the air above them. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known to nearly everyone in Harlem as Bumpy, was seated at a corner table inside a restaurant on 116th Street just before 8 in the morning. He wore a charcoal gray suit, pressed and clean, beneath a dark overcoat that he had not removed despite the warmth inside the room. He had a small cup of coffee in front of him and a paperback book, Langston Hughes, one of the simple stories, lying open beside the saucer. He read while he waited, turning pages with the unhurried motion of a man who had learned long ago that waiting was not the same as wasting time. He was 44 years old. The scar along his left cheek, the one he had carried since his earliest years in the street, had faded to a smooth, pale line that most people who saw him regularly had stopped noticing. He had the build of a man who had once been lean and hard, and who now carried extra weight not from softness but from years, from the particular density that accumulates in a man who has survived things that were designed to destroy him. The meeting he was waiting for involved a man named Gerald Holt. Holt was not a criminal in the formal sense. He was a building owner. 6 properties spread across central Harlem, some of them residential, some of them commercial, who had, over a period of several years, developed an understanding with various people in the informal economy of the neighborhood. He rented space to numbers banks. He allowed certain back rooms to operate as card games on weekday nights. He collected his payments and kept his distance, and the arrangement had functioned smoothly enough that no one had felt the need to examine it closely. Holt was a man of comfortable middle status, not powerful enough to be treated as a partner by anyone serious, not poor enough to be treated as a subject. He occupied that useful middle ground where men who are neither dangerous nor irrelevant tend to position themselves. What Holt had done in the weeks prior to this March morning was not dramatic in its mechanics. It was the kind of betrayal that happens in degrees. A slow shift of loyalty that the person committing it rarely acknowledges to themselves as betrayal at all. He had begun meeting with representatives of a figure from downtown, a man connected to the broader syndicate structure that had, for years, been attempting to consolidate control over Harlem's numbers operations. These were not meetings in any formal sense. They were conversations, had over meals or during walks, in which Holt had offered information, operational details, the locations of certain counting rooms, the schedule of a particular collection route, in exchange for assurances that his properties would be protected and his income guaranteed in whatever new arrangement might come. He had told himself that he was simply being practical. He had told himself that the old arrangements were weakening, that the landscape was shifting, and that a man in his position had to think carefully about where he placed his trust. He had not told himself that he was handing over information that could get people killed, because men in Holt's position rarely state to themselves the full consequences of the choices they make. Bumpy knew. He had known for approximately 11 days before this morning. He had not confronted Holt. He had not changed anything visible about the arrangement. He had allowed the meetings to continue, had allowed the information to flow, and had said nothing to anyone except two men he trusted with the kind of trust that takes a decade to build and cannot be manufactured quickly. He had watched, and he had thought, and he had waited, because he understood something that Holt, and, more importantly, the men downtown who were using Holt, did not yet understand. That the moment you allow a trap to close around you without reacting, you learn far more about its architecture than you ever could by springing it early. Holt arrived at the restaurant at 8:15, 12 minutes late, which was itself a small signal. He was a man in his mid-50s, heavy-set, with a gray hat he wore slightly tilted, and a coat with a fur collar that he had owned for at least 10 years. He came in with the mild, purposeful air of a man who has rehearsed his entrance. He sat across from Bumpy, ordered coffee from a waitress who came immediately, and began talking about the weather, and then about a problem with one of his buildings on 118th Street, a leaking pipe, a dispute with a tenant. It was ordinary conversation, and he delivered it with the ease of a man who believed he was managing the mood of the meeting, setting a tone of normalcy that would carry them through to whatever business needed discussing. Bumpy listened. He asked one or two questions about the building, not because he cared about the pipe, but because asking questions was a way of letting a man believe he was in control of the conversation. He sipped his coffee. He did not look at Holt with suspicion or with coldness. He looked at him the way he looked at most people in the ordinary course of a day, with calm, measured attention, giving nothing away, taking everything in. When the business portion of the conversation arrived, a discussion of rental, arrangements for the coming quarter, of which spaces would need to be renewed, and at what terms, Bumpy responded with the same measured clarity he always brought to such matters. He agreed to terms that were fair, noted one point he wanted reconsidered, and did not push the issue when Holt declined. The meeting lasted 40 minutes in total. When it ended, both men stood, shook hands, and said they would speak again in 2 weeks. Holt put his hat back on and walked out into the cold. He did not know, as he turned north on Lenox Avenue, that he had just attended his own ending. Bumpy sat for a few minutes after Holt left. He ordered another coffee. He returned to his book. The waitress, a woman named Clara, who had worked in that restaurant for 9 years, and had served Bumpy dozens of times, refilled his cup without being asked, and said nothing because she could read, as most people who spent time around him learned to do, the particular quality of his silence. Some of his silences invited conversation. This one did not. What Bumpy was doing in those quiet minutes was not reviewing his anger or measuring his wounded pride. Anger he had understood since he was a young man navigating the streets of Charleston, South Carolina, and then the harder streets of Harlem was a resource that spent itself faster than it produced results. He had seen men ruin themselves with anger, had watched gifted, capable men destroy in an afternoon what it had taken them years to build, because they had allowed themselves to react to an insult or a betrayal at the speed of emotion rather than the speed of strategy. He had made that mistake himself in his younger years, and he carried the memory of those mistakes with the particular attention a man gives to the things that nearly destroyed him. What he was doing, sitting quietly at that corner table, was thinking about structure, not about Gerald Holt specifically. Holt was a symptom, not a disease, but about the broader architecture of what was being attempted. The men downtown who were using Holt were not new to Harlem. They had been probing the edges of Harlem's numbers operations for years, looking for weaknesses, testing the loyalties of peripheral figures, calculating whether the community's informal economy could be absorbed into a more centrally controlled structure. They had succeeded in other neighborhoods. They had moved through sections of Brooklyn and the Bronx with relative ease, in part because those areas had not developed the same density of interlocking loyalty, the same deep roots of community identity that Harlem had built over decades. Harlem was different, not because its people were more virtuous, but because its history had forced it to become more deliberate about protecting what it had built. Bumpy understood that the attempt being made through Holt was not simply a business move. It was an attempt to dissolve the web of local control that allowed Harlem's informal economy to function as a community institution rather than simply as an extraction mechanism. The numbers operation in Harlem, the daily lottery that working people played for pennies and dollars, that employed runners and counters and bankers across hundreds of blocks, was, in its functional reality, something more than gambling. It was employment. It was credit. In a neighborhood where banks routinely refused loans to black residents, regardless of their financial standing. It was a circulation of money that stayed local, that got reinvested in businesses and families and community structures, rather than flowing upward and outward to institutions that had no stake in the neighborhood's survival. The men downtown did not see any of this. They saw revenue, and they saw inefficiency, and they saw an opportunity. They were not wrong about any of those observations. They were simply wrong about their ability to take what they saw without consequences. Bumpy left the restaurant at 9:20 and walked north. He walked slowly, as he usually did, with the steady, unhurried gait of a man who has decided that rushing is a form of announcing your weakness to the street. He nodded to people he knew, stopped briefly at one corner to speak to an older man who ran a shoeshine stand and who served, in the informal network of the neighborhood, as one of the most reliable observers of daily life on that block. He asked about nothing in particular. He listened to what the man offered without prompting. He continued walking. Over the next several days, Bumpy held a series of conversations that, to anyone observing them from the outside, would have appeared entirely unremarkable. He met with a lawyer named David Payne, a Columbia-trained man who had practiced in Harlem for 15 years, and who handled a range of matters for figures across the neighborhood's commercial life, legitimate and otherwise. Payne was not a man who asked too many questions about the business of his clients. He was, however, a man of considerable intelligence and of a particular ethical formation that placed loyalty to the community above most other considerations. He and Bumpy had a relationship built on years of practical cooperation and on a shared understanding that the neighborhood's survival required people in different positions to function as something like a coordinated system. Even when no formal coordination existed, Bumpy explained the situation to Payne with the same calm directness he brought to most things. No dramatization, no performance of grievance, just the clear, sequential presentation of facts and their implications. Payne listened, asked 4 precise questions, and then sat quietly for a moment before beginning to speak about what could be done from a legal and structural standpoint. What Payne identified was this: 3 of Holt's 6 properties carried liens or outstanding title questions that had been unresolved for years. The kind of administrative backlog that was common in Harlem's real estate market, where properties changed hands informally and paperwork was often incomplete. Under normal circumstances, these irregularities were invisible because no one had any reason to press on them. If someone with legal standing chose to press, to file complaints with the city, to request title investigations, to contact the relevant municipal offices and insist on resolution, the process would not be swift, but it would be real, and it would create precisely the kind of institutional friction that made properties difficult to operate and nearly impossible to use as the basis for new financial arrangements with outside parties. The men downtown would find it very hard to incorporate properties into any formal or semi-formal structure while those properties were under active legal examination. Holt, whose entire value to the people he was dealing with rested on his ability to deliver clean, usable space, would find himself suddenly unable to deliver what he had promised. Payne agreed to begin the process. He would file on behalf of a tenant advocacy organization, one that Bumpy had supported financially for years, quietly and without publicity, and the complaints would move through official channels at the pace that official channels moved. This was not a dramatic move. It would produce no immediate visible effect. But it was a foundation, and Bumpy understood that foundations were built before walls, and walls before rooms, and rooms before the house that everyone could eventually see. The second set of conversations happened over 3 days. In the middle of that week, and they involved people who operated the actual ground-level infrastructure of the numbers business across central Harlem, the station bosses who supervised the runners, the women who ran the counting rooms, the men who handled the cash at the higher levels of the operation. These were not theatrical meetings. They happened in apartments, in back rooms, in the short, quiet spaces between other activities. Bumpy did not deliver speeches. He told each person, individually, what he knew and what it meant. He told them that a pressure was coming, that it was already underway, that it had been underway for some time, and that the people applying that pressure were counting on fracture, on the individual calculation of survival that causes people to make separate deals and thereby give away the collective strength they do not realize they hold. He told them that the only response to that kind of pressure was the opposite of what the pressure was designed to produce. Not separation, but coherence. Not every man for himself, but every man aware that his survival and every other man's survival were the same question. He was not asking for declarations of loyalty or for promises. He had been in Harlem long enough to know that promises made under pressure were structurally different from promises made in calm, that the value of a commitment was not in the words used to make it, but in the interests it served. What he was doing in these conversations was making the calculation of self-interest clear. He was showing each person, specifically and concretely, why the arrangement being offered from downtown was worse for them individually than the arrangement they currently had, not because of sentiment or history, but because of money, because of control, because of what their daily life would look like in 2 years if they accepted the terms being extended to them, and in 2 years if they did not. He laid out these calculations with patience and without condescension, and the people he spoke to understood them, because they were practical people who had been making complex calculations about survival since childhood. By the end of that week, he had spoken to 11 people. None of them were asked to do anything dramatic. They were asked to do nothing, in fact. to continue exactly as they had been doing, to give no signals that anything had changed, to maintain the surface of normal operations entirely intact. This was its own kind of discipline, requiring each person to hold knowledge without expressing it, to interact with people they now understood differently, without allowing that understanding to show. It was the kind of discipline that most people do not know they possess until someone asks them to exercise it. The third area of action was the one that moved most slowly, and that Bumpy spent the most time preparing. It had to do with the economic relationships that bound Holt's properties to the broader neighborhood economy. Holt rented commercial space to a range of small businesses: a laundromat, a small restaurant, a tailor's shop, a record store, two operations that functioned partly as informal banks for people who could not access formal credit. These businesses were not large. None of them, individually, represented significant revenue for Holt, but collectively, the relationships they represented were the texture of the neighborhood, the daily economic activity of ordinary people who moved through Holt's spaces without thinking much about the man who owned them. Bumpy began, through intermediaries, making it quietly known that alternative spaces were available, not through any dramatic announcement or overt campaign, simply through the natural channels of neighborhood conversation, the way information about practical matters moved through Harlem at all times. A building on 117th Street had space opening up. Another on 8th Avenue had a ground floor that had been recently renovated. The terms being offered were reasonable, more reasonable in most cases than what Holt was charging. The suggestion was made, gently and without pressure, that some of the current tenants might find the alternatives worth considering. This was not coercion. No one was told they had to move. No one was threatened. No one was made to feel that remaining where they were would have consequences. The conversations were the ordinary conversations of a neighborhood that knew its own geography. The sharing of information between people who trusted each other and who had long understood that economic decisions made collectively had different outcomes than economic decisions made in isolation. Over the following weeks, 3 of Holt's commercial tenants began making inquiries about alternative spaces. One of them, the record store, had already given informal notice. What was happening across these 3 tracks of action, the legal, the operational, and the economic, was a slow withdrawal of the infrastructure on which Holt's value to the people downtown depended. He had offered them buildings. He had offered them access, relationships, positioned space in the middle of a neighborhood that outsiders could not navigate without local cooperation. What was quietly happening was the removal of that positioning, the reduction of Holt from a man with something to offer to a man with a set of legally complicated properties, whose tenants were restless and whose usefulness was diminishing week by week. None of this was visible yet. On the surface, nothing had changed. Holt still collected his rent. His conversations with the men downtown continued. He believed, in the middle weeks of March and into April, that the arrangement he was building was proceeding on schedule. He did not know that the schedule he believed he was following had already been overtaken by a different timeline entirely. It was in the first week of April that the first visible effect appeared. The title investigation that Payne had initiated produced, as such investigations always eventually do, a formal inquiry letter from a city office, a dry, bureaucratic document asking for documentation related to the ownership history of 2 of Holt's properties. The letter was not a crisis in itself. But letters of that kind required responses, and responses required lawyers, and lawyers who examined those particular title questions would find material that would take months to resolve, and that would, in the meantime, make it difficult to move forward with any plans that depended on those properties being clean. The men downtown, when they heard about the letters, became careful. Careful people slow down. Slow people miss timing. And timing, in the informal economy, was everything. Around the same time, the coherence that Bumpy had spent those quiet conversations building began to produce its own effects. The men downtown had been working on 2 or 3 figures within Harlem's numbers operation. Men who, they believed, were positioned to accept new arrangements, and whose acceptance would create a visible break in the existing structure, demonstrating to others that the transition was inevitable and that continued resistance was merely delay. What they found, instead, was that each conversation they initiated seemed somehow already known to the people they were trying to reach, not in a way that anyone could point to, not through any dramatic response or refusal, but in the way that matters most in that world, the way of shifted availability, of men who were suddenly busy, of meetings that were agreed to and then postponed, of the gentle, inexorable friction of people who had decided not to be available. One of the men downtown, a figure named Caruso, who had handled most of the direct conversations with Holt, and who had been the architect of the Harlem approach, made a direct communication to Bumpy in the middle of April. It came through a third party, and it was framed not as a threat but as a suggestion that certain tensions might be eased, that certain mutual interests might be better served, that a conversation might be useful. The framing was careful and the language was measured, and it communicated, without saying so directly, that the situation was not proceeding as anticipated, and that the people who had initiated it were willing to discuss its terms. Bumpy did not respond immediately. He let 4 days pass. He did not, during those 4 days, discuss the communication with anyone except Payne, whose counsel was practical and whose reading of the situation was clear. The communication was an opening, not an offer. An opening required patience, not speed. What Caruso and the people he represented needed was to believe that the alternative to conversation was worse than conversation. 4 days of silence was a contribution to that belief, so was 5 days. On the 6th day, Bumpy sent word through the same channel that he was willing to meet. The meeting happened in a restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. Neutral territory, as such meetings required. Bumpy arrived with Payne and with one other man, a figure from Harlem's community, who had no formal connection to the numbers business, but who represented, in his person, the broader stake of the neighborhood in the conversation. A man named Clarence Webb, who was a deacon at a large Baptist church on 125th Street, and who was also, in the practical reality of Harlem's social architecture, a man of considerable standing and influence. Webb's presence was not accidental. It was a statement about what was being negotiated, not simply the business terms of an informal economy, but the character of a community's relationship to its own life. Caruso arrived with 2 men, and without the easy confidence he had brought to conversations earlier in the process. He was a man in his late 50s, heavy-featured, in a good suit, with the particular bearing of someone who has spent many years being deferred to, and who is not entirely comfortable in a room where that deference is not automatic. He opened the conversation with pleasantries that lasted less than 2 minutes, and then moved to the matter directly, which Bumpy noted and respected, because directness even from an adversary, was a form of honesty that made working conversations possible. What Caruso proposed was a partnership structure, a formal arrangement by which certain operations in Harlem would be linked to the broader syndicate network in ways that provided protection, capital access, and operational support, in exchange for a percentage of revenue and an understanding that major decisions would require approval from the syndicate's representatives. It was, he said, an arrangement that had worked well in other places. It was, he said, a modernization of something that was already happening informally. Bumpy listened to the entire proposal without interrupting. Then, he said, in the same quiet voice he used for most conversations, that he understood what was being proposed, that he did not think it was the right arrangement for Harlem, and that he was prepared to explain why in as much detail as would be useful. He then did exactly that, for approximately 20 minutes, making a case that was legal in its framing. Payne had helped prepare this portion, economic in its evidence, and community-grounded in its conclusion. He was not angry. He was not threatening. He was a man making an argument, and he made it as one would make an argument to a person capable of being convinced, because treating the person you are negotiating with as capable of being convinced is a form of respect that creates the conditions for resolution. The meeting lasted 2.5 hours. It did not produce a final agreement that day. It produced a series of subsequent conversations over the following 3 weeks, in which the terms of a different kind of arrangement were slowly worked out. The final understanding, which was never written down and which existed only in the shared knowledge of the people who had been present for its negotiation, established this: that Harlem's numbers operations would remain under local management, that the existing structure of community-level control would not be disturbed, that certain specific coordination arrangements related to protection, to the management of disputes that crossed neighborhood lines, would be established on terms that did not require the surrender of local authority. The syndicate would have a relationship with Harlem, but it would be a relationship between parties who each held something the other needed, not a relationship between a landlord and a tenant. Gerald Holt was not part of this conversation. He had been, by the time these final arrangements were made aware, through the slow withdrawal of the things that had made him useful, that his role in the situation was over. He was not harmed. He was simply reduced to his actual dimensions. A man with 6 properties, 3 of which were under legal examination, whose tenants were leaving, whose usefulness to the people he had been dealing with had been methodically removed. He continued to own his buildings. He continued to operate at a diminished level in the neighborhood's economic life. But the position he had imagined for himself, the intermediary through whom a new order in Harlem would be established, had ceased to exist, not through any act of violence or any dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet, steady removal of every condition that position required. On a morning in early May, Bumpy was again at the corner table in this restaurant on 116th Street. Clara refilled his coffee without being asked. He was reading a different book this time, a history of the African diaspora, written by a scholar whose name most people on the street would not have recognized, because Bumpy's reading had always been wider and less predictable than the people who knew him primarily by reputation tended to assume. He had been, in his youth, a reader before he was anything else, a boy who had grown up in a household that valued language, and who had carried that value through decades of a life that did not, from the outside, look like the life of a man who valued language. He was not celebrating anything on that May morning. He did not experience what had happened over the preceding 2 months as a victory in any simple sense. He experienced it as a maintenance, the ongoing work of protecting something that required protection in a neighborhood whose history had been shaped by the persistence of people who understood that what they were protecting was not just their own interests, but something larger than their own interests. Harlem had always required this. It had required it since the first decades of the 20th century, when the neighborhood had become something new in American life. A concentration of black culture and black intellect and black economic activity that was unlike anything that had existed before, and that every force arrayed against black advancement in America had recognized, on some level, as a threat to the order it was trying to maintain. Bumpy had not invented this understanding. He had inherited it from figures who had come before him, from the men and women who had built the numbers business in Harlem in the 1920s and 1930s as a response to the formal economy's refusal to admit black participation on equal terms, from the community leaders who had navigated the pressures of white organized crime's incursion into Harlem in the 1930s and 1940s, from the lawyers and church figures and business owners who had understood that the informal and formal economies of the neighborhood were not separate worlds but different expressions of the same community's effort to survive and to sustain itself. He was one person in a long line of people who had been doing the same essential work under different conditions and different names. What he had done in this particular instance was demonstrate something that the people who kept trying to absorb Harlem's economic life from the outside kept failing to understand. That the neighborhood's strength was not located in any individual person or any single operation, but in the density of relationship and the depth of shared interest that connected people across every level of its life. You could not simply remove the top of a structure like that, because the structure did not work the way that kind of thinking assumed. It was not a hierarchy with a single point of vulnerability at its peak. It was a web, horizontal, lateral, multiply connected, and when you pressed on it from outside, it did not collapse inward. It distributed the pressure outward, spreading it across so many points of contact that no single point was ever asked to bear more than it could hold. The people who had tried to move through Holt had assumed that Bumpy's authority was personal, that it rested on his individual reputation, on the fear or respect that his name produced in the street. They had assumed that if you worked around him carefully enough, cultivating peripheral figures, building a base of alternative relationships, you could create conditions in which his authority was suddenly unsupported, isolated, easy to isolate further, and eventually to replace. They had not understood that what looked like personal authority was actually a form of institutional trust, the accumulated result of years of demonstrable reliability, of being present in the neighborhood, not only in the transactional sense, but in the full human sense, of being someone whose judgment people had tested across enough situations and enough time that they knew what it was worth. Trust of that kind cannot be replicated quickly. It cannot be purchased, and it cannot be manufactured. It can only be built slowly through the consistent application of the same values across different situations and different pressures and different temptations. Bumpy had spent 30 years building it, not consciously, not as a strategy, but as the natural expression of who he was. a man who had been shaped by deprivation and violence and injustice into someone who understood, at a level below argument, that the only thing that made the life he was living bearable and meaningful was the degree to which it served something larger than itself. The runners who made their rounds across central Harlem in the weeks after that early May morning continued their routes without incident. The women who ran the counting rooms continued their work. The station bosses continued to supervise. The money continued to move through the neighborhood in its daily circulation, into groceries and rents and small purchases, and the informal loans that kept families together through difficult weeks. None of them going about their work in the ordinary course of those spring days knew the specific details of what had been negotiated on their behalf. Most of them did not know that anything had been negotiated at all. They knew only that the pressure they had sensed at the edges of their daily life, the particular atmospheric tension of a neighborhood that feels something large moving toward it, had eased, and that the morning arrived again with its ordinary rhythms, and that the ordinary rhythms of daily life in Harlem were worth protecting, worth the full application of whatever intelligence and patience and organizational capacity a person possessed. Gerald Holt's buildings on 118th Street were sold 2 years later to a different owner, a man from within the neighborhood, as it turned out, whose acquisition of the properties was facilitated in part by the legal work that Payne's office had been doing. The title irregularities, once resolved, produced a situation in which the properties were available at terms that made them accessible to local buyers in a way they had not been before. This was not a planned outcome, exactly. It was the kind of consequence that follows from setting a process in motion and then allowing it to run at its own pace. Bumpy was not directly involved in the sale. He heard about it the way he heard about most things, from someone who mentioned it in passing, on a street corner or in a restaurant, as one of the unremarkable facts of neighborhood life. The broader pattern of what Harlem's numbers operation had withstood, the sustained attempt by outside syndicate forces to absorb it, beginning in the late 1940s and continuing through the early 1950s, was not unique to this episode. It was one of many such pressures, applied from different angles and through different instruments, that the neighborhood had navigated over 2 decades. The fact that it had navigated them, the fact that Harlem's informal economy retained a degree of local character and local control for longer than similar economies in comparable neighborhoods, was not the result of any single person's effort, but the particular quality of the response in these years, the particular intelligence and patience and organizational coherence that characterized how the neighborhood met these pressures, bore the mark of specific people who had chosen to spend their capability in service of something, collective rather than simply individual. Bumpy Johnson's would spend another 15 years in Harlem after that spring. He would face other pressures, other attempts, other moments requiring the same discipline, the same willingness to absorb a provocation without reacting at the speed of emotion, to think about the system behind the surface, to build coalitions patiently, and to execute strategies slowly, and to trust that change made carefully was more durable than change made fast. He would also face the direct force of the federal government, spending significant years of his later life in prison, as the state brought its own tools to bear on the informal economy he had worked to protect. He bore those years with the same stillness he had brought to everything else, reading, thinking, corresponding with people in the neighborhood, who kept him connected to its life. He returned to Harlem each time he left it. He always returned because Harlem was not simply where he had made his life. It was the subject of his life, the community whose survival and dignity he had understood from the time he was a young man newly arrived from the South to be inseparable from his own. He died there in 1968 in a restaurant he frequented on 116th Street, the same block, not so far from the same corner table. He had been playing chess with a group of friends, as he often did in the evenings of those late years. He simply stopped breathing, quietly, in a chair, with the board still set between him and the man he had been playing. It was the kind of ending that, when you know the life that preceded it, feels less like irony than like resolution. A man who had lived most of his adult life in motion and in vigilance, finding stillness at last in a place he had spent 40 years refusing to abandon. The Harlem he left behind was not the Harlem he had arrived in. It was a neighborhood that had been changed by migration and urban renewal, and the particular violence of American policy toward black communities in the mid-20th century. But it was also a neighborhood that had survived, that had maintained, through all of those pressures, the core of what made it something more than a geographical location. The density of human relationship, the shared memory of struggle, the particular culture that emerges when people are forced to create from what they have rather than what they were given. Some part of that survival was material and political and economic, the result of specific decisions made by specific people at specific moments. Some part of it was the simple fact of presence, of people choosing, again and again, to stay. The morning of March 14, 1952 had looked unremarkable. A man in a gray suit at a corner table, reading a book, drinking coffee, waiting for a meeting that he had decided, 11 days earlier, to allow to happen exactly as it was going to happen. He had known what was coming. He had chosen to see it fully before he responded to it. That choice, to wait, to watch, to understand before acting, was dramatic in its expression. It did not look, from the outside, like anything at all. But it was the beginning of a set of consequences that would take weeks to develop and months to complete, and years to fully understand, and it was characteristic of the man who made it. A man who had learned, through the particular education of a hard life, lived in a community that required the best of everyone who lived in it, that the most powerful thing you could do in a moment of danger was not to show what you knew,